Hi, everyone. I'm excited to join you with today's Space Sustainability panel. I'm very excited to talk about a lot of cultural and environmental considerations as we're discussing space sustainability. So we've got 4 esteemed panelists for you today, and I'll introduce them before we get started. So to my left, we have Dan Hawk. It's the right page. 1 second. Too many pages here. So Dan was born and raised on the Oneida Indian Reservation in Wisconsin. And in 2022, Dan addressed the United Nations Legal Subcommittee of the Committee on the Peaceful Use of Outer Space by providing the history-making general exchange of views. Dan has been working on many projects, as he was telling me yesterday, but he's appointed to lead the Lunar Surface Innovation Consortium, Lunar Dust Interoperability and Standards Focus Group. He's currently working with OSHA to prevent dust explosions in mines and factories. His career started when he enlisted in the Army National Guard. He's done a lot of different work from power plant operator to founding the first nation's launch and tethered aerostat program. He also launched BisonSat, which is the first Navy satellite launched into space. So Dan can tell you about many of his other activities, but that's a short summary. So great to have you with us, Dan. Thanks. And to the left of Dan, we've got Shannon Abelson, who's currently finishing her final year as a doctoral candidate in philosophy at the Indiana University, Bloomington. And she's working on the philosophy of astronomy and astrophysics, general philosophy of science, and space environmentalism. She's interested in models of simulations in physical science, as well as epistemic and methodological aspects of data-driven science. And she's working on normative aspects of space exploration. Her dissertation is titled An Epistemology of Data-Driven Astronomy and Astrophysics. So thanks for joining us, Shannon. And then we have a joint presentation between Dr. Janet Tinoco, who is next, and Dr. Tinoco is a systems engineer and professor of management and marketing at Embry-Riddle in Daytona Beach. Her expertise is in technical and strategic management, innovation and business policy, particularly with respect to defense and space systems. She has over 35 years of industry and academic experience worldwide. After she graduated with her engineering degree, she was a systems integration engineer and technical manager for Lockheed Martin and a project engineer at Northrop Grumman. And since her time at Embry-Riddle, she's been involved in space research, focusing on spaceports as well as space debris mitigation from a business perspective. And then last but not least, presenting with Dr. Tinoco, we've got LaQuila Alonzo, who's an Embry-Riddle undergrad, and she's a tribal member of the Navajo Nation, raised on the Tohajili Indian Reservation in New Mexico. And a lot of her upbringing was on the reservation and as part of the Laguna Como Pueblo tribe. She's a U.S. Air Force reservist with an occupation in mission systems technology with 15 years of experience overall, active duty and reserves. So very exciting to get her perspective. And now she's at Embry-Riddle pursuing her Bachelor of Science in Spaceflight Operations. I'm excited to hear from both of you. So Dan, I will let you go first with your presentation for roughly 6 to 8 minutes.
Hi, everyone. Dan Hawk, again, I'm Oneida, part of the Iroquois Confederacy, and I would be originally from New York, the Seneca, Cayuga, Onondaga, Oneida, and Mohawk. It's great to be here, my second year. Last year we had an Indigenous presentation, Indigenous perspectives on space and space debris. Today, I really don't have a presentation, but what I wanted to say is a few things regarding my colleagues here and the Navajo Nation in particular. As we go about as Native American people, we at a time that we are wanting to go into space. From the United Nations perspective, it is a human right, it's a right of self-determination, right of equal access. That we look at tribal spaceports as a way of getting into space and going into the space industry in general, and partly because Indigenous people in the past have been overlooked, we've been overseen, we have not been acknowledged from Indigenous point of view. From Indigenous point of view, but also. It's the fact that unfortunately racism plays a big part of that. But what the space industry doesn't know is that we have 554 federally recognized tribes in the United States. We have 630 tribes in Canada. We have indigenous populations around the world. And we have something to offer. We are people too, right? So the idea here is that regarding the space industry and indigenous people, now is the time to work together. We look at Artemis going to the moon and Mars to stay. It is about inclusion. It's about including indigenous people and not excluding us people. When I talk about what we have to offer, we have land, we have resources, we have technology, we have STEM scholars. We have the ability to help the space industry with going to the moon, Mars to stay, in a way that we consider unification. So we talk about space development and space exploration as being a unified vision of space. We really don't have a unified vision of space if indigenous people are excluded. And that's what I wanted to say. Thank you.
Back to Paul. Okay, so I guess the best context to give for this project that I'm working on is that I'm an epistemologist by trade. It's what I work on. I study how we know things, what conditions for knowledge we should have, but I also work on what sorts of normative constraints we should impose societally. And so this project came out of me thinking, what kind of normative constraints are appropriate for space exploration given the uncertainty and the difficult epistemic situation we find ourselves in with respect to attributing a lot of negative effects that can happen in a space environment to a specific actor or set of actors. It's difficult to do. Sometimes it's easier than other times. You know, if your satellite gets hit by a giant chunk of something that says Russia on the side, you kind of know who it came from. But under other situations, it's much harder to attribute. So I was thinking about this from the perspective of some stuff that's going on in climate change attribution, of which I'm familiar because of my advisor. So in climate change attribution, they're not necessarily looking to put liability or accountability or blame on any specific party. They're more considering questions about how to attribute specific weather events to climate change itself. And then people draw conclusions about liability and accountability from that. But there are two main kind of camps in the probabilistic risk-based assessment going on in climate change attribution. There's the kind of traditional camp, it's traditional risk-based assessment. You're going to evaluate the null hypothesis that an event cannot be attributable to climate change and try to rule out type 1 errors. You want to avoid type 1 errors. These are called false positive results. And then there's the other side, which is newer. It's called the storyline approach, where you do something more like an autopsy of a negative event to try and trace back a specific cause. And then that side, you're trying to avoid false negatives. Now, the reason why this came up in my mind as maybe relevant to our epistemic situation in space exploration and the space industry is because we find ourselves similar to climate change scientists, sometimes unable to attribute in the way that we want and having to work with limited information. And so there's a divide in that field about whether or not we should privilege being extra careful and not asserting attribution when we're not overly confident in it, or we should exercise more of a concern for preventing negative effects from continuing to occur, and those are considered the more social humanitarian motivations that would inform. So the general takeaway that I have here for this project is that in the space domain, I think largely we're not able to do storyline techniques in a lot of cases. But I think the important lesson to take from the story perspective is that we should perhaps look more to minimizing type 2 errors than minimizing type 1 errors, because we want to privilege a vision of accountability and attribution where what we're doing is encouraging the protection of an environment and the implementation of mitigation strategies that would not be blanket ones that could rule out newer entries into the space domain. So if we had very strict regulations on every actor entering the space economy, that would create a lot of restrictions for newer entrants. But we also want to protect the environment that we're working in. And so I think we should try to find a balance here. And looking at what's going on in climate change attribution, that is the way it's trending, is to try and balance these two perspectives and go about attribution in a way that both recognizes the epistemic limitations that we have, but also look towards working with solutions that protect the environment and offer equitable access to that environment without strict policies that create undue burdens on certain members. Thank you.
Just one moment.
So
our topic, as Dan had spoken about tribal nations, is about tribal nation spaceports opening access to outer space for American Indians. Many people are unknowledgeable of the foundational principles that play a key role in Indian affairs. As you can see in these two slides, it was the main basis for starting our research to begin with. On the left side, you can see that the current proposed U.S. spaceports, and then on the right side is a map of all indigenous American Indian U.S. tribes. As you can see, our question was, why not tribal spaceports? There's spaceports in the designated areas that which we designated in that circle. So the question was, why not tribal spaceports? One way tribal nations can support the space economy is by developing and operating licensed spaceports, contributing to the space network. Notion of the tribal spaceports in the U.S. brings to the forefront a unique and complex context that involves land trusts and congressional power, investment and risks, conflicting cultures and values, and historical injustice and distrust. A little backstory, Janet Tinoco will talk to you about this.
Thank you. So the whole notion of spaceports to begin with is a very complex project. And then to add the complexity of Native Americans and what has happened throughout history, it just makes it even more challenging. So there are 573 sovereign tribal nations in the U.S., 229 in Alaska, and the remainder in the 35 other states. Right now, the U.S. government holds about 58 million acres of land in trust. So there are advantages to the tribal communities for land in trust, but there are also huge disadvantages. And again, I'm new to this, so if I say anything wrong, please let me know. Disadvantages are the Congress regulates lease land. So even if a tribal nation wants to lease land for a spaceport, there are challenges overcoming that. And they also, of course, have power over right-of-way and easement. And then on the extreme, Congress apparently has the power to disband tribes and also distribute assets. So we started looking at, the big picture of, okay, so what can we do with the land? You have to kind of start somewhere. And there are many, many business models for tribal spaceports. So the easy one is to look at using a general aviation airport and getting a spaceport license or site operator license for that particular airport. And that's where I started from this particular section. I looked at the NIPIAS, which lists the federally recognized airports, and found some interesting information. There are 23 airports that are designated Native American. Most are publicly owned by the nation. One is privately owned, and the interesting one up there with Alaska, one was state owned. But then I started looking at the runways, because if they're going to have horizontal launch and return, you need a pretty good way to do that. And you can see what we found here: gravel, a lot of cases gravel, some asphalt, varying lengths of runways. The one that gets the most federal money is Grand Canyon West, because they also have the most enplanements. And, you know, again, varying size of different runways. But what really surprised me is that none of them had an air traffic control tower. Most facilities are unattended. Many lack hangars and other needed infrastructure. Most support small general aviation aircraft, so think of, you know, prop planes, single engine type. These are helipads, so you can tell there's some heliport work there. Again, runways were varied in terms of number and size and integrity of the runway itself. And whether or not the land is in trust and how that works out, we're still kind of working on that together. But what was clear to me is that Native American airports already are at a disadvantage compared to some of the other general aviation airports that have successfully obtained a site operator license for space. So think Cecil in Florida, I think Mojave. We had a discussion with Virgin Orbit today in Mojave. Space Coast in Florida as well, Colorado. They all have very good infrastructure to start with.
So the importance and relationship of lands to American Indian tribes it cannot be understated. In order to understand, it needs to be spoken about. And it's really good to be here, especially sitting next to Dan and all the work he's done. History shows that land has been at the centerfold for American Indians due to the natural resource wealth. The view of their land does not constitute money or power. Instead, it's actually seen as gifts to the individuals and their tribes. The land, much like anything developed from the creator or higher power, is a living being. Therefore, it has a spirit or soul. The significance of the land and living beings have a greater purpose. And if their land in their community needs to be considered for spaceports, and this ties into like the traditions and customs. I give an example of a breakdown from my tribe, the Navajo tribe, and it goes back down to the roots of just our arrival story of Native Americans and the Navajo and the Diné people, and its origins on the land and how considerably it's intertwined. It is said that the compound word D-I, meaning up, and ne and e, meaning down, is how the origins of the 5-figure human being originated and came to the surface from an up location, which is the dip, and then a down location, meaning the ne. This is only one story of 500 plus tribes throughout the United States, and clearly traditions and customs are still being held today. General impacts when it comes to spaceport, which you might be asking is, you know, what are the positives and the impacts? Society and for the industry, there are similar positives: economic growth, access to venture capitals for both sides, job opportunity expansion, and educational diversification or expansion as well. For the negativities, we had found that financial risk would be either for both sides, dependent upon if there was going to be private financial personnel trying to be a part of what was going on with spaceports on Indigenous tribes. For the most part, a lot of the negative impacts involve the environmental aspects of tribal lands. Impacts to the flora and fauna is one of the biggest ones that I hear a lot about, people questioning why tribal entities, especially for spaceports. And of course, that comes with the pushback by the local communities. So in large part, when it comes to that though, we've come to figure out that it's really just the relationship part and communication, dialogue, limit fact that associates with that, and if we were to fix that, then it would alleviate or at least minimize some of those negative impacts on local indigenous communities. It's super important to understand that every tribe is unique. My tribe is also not the same as what Dan and his tribe. We all have different economic developments due to that. And for each tribe, it varies based on their cultural beliefs, their values, their heritage, and then just the overcoming lasting effects of colonization. It's what we found. And this can be seen, these impacts can be seen from two different American Indian tribes in New Mexico. One being my tribe specifically, and then another being a totally different tribe, which are Pueblos. In the picture, you can see that Santa Ana Pueblo had this recent partnership with Tesla. And during this time, one tribe can openly trust and build partnerships negotiating with companies like Tesla for the next generation of their people. In my tribe, the other tends to isolate itself from outside agencies due to the possibilities of losing land and tribal investments, leading the community to barely meet the bare minimums of education, housing, and natural resources. So what will it take? Different scenarios should be addressed and explored by the American Indian communities to understand obstacles, risks, and benefits. The industry and state and federal government trust-build partnerships and assistance would also may be needed, and then changes the current laws that directly or indirectly impact American tribe advancements in the space economy. Also, like Janet had spoken about, business model analyses would also may be needed, especially because of their unique contacts with each tribe. And then lastly, possibly an act of Congress would also be integral for the implementation of another act, much like the Indian Gaming Regulatory Act that allowed Native American tribes to incorporate and make it a little bit easier to the gaming industry. And then lastly, the deeper question that we came up with is, how do we overcome the distrust and the cycle of bias that perpetuate American Indian tribes not self-reliant or capable? There's three critical things that need to be happened, and the first one is public awareness on both sides. That's the American Indians and outside agencies. And then just education on the tribe's culture, laws, regulations, and history. And then secondly, there needs to be some type of multiple or ongoing efforts through meaningful dialogue and consultation. Establishments of trust between all parties is also needed. And like Dan said, one of the biggest things is just, I think we all forget that we're all human, we're all people. So inclusion is, it doesn't mean just one type of person or race or color. We're all in it together, and I think this is one of the first steps that we all need to look into.
Thanks. Really love all these presentations and how interdisciplinary they are. So I have some questions for the audience or for panelists before we get to questions from the audience. So starting with Shannon, are there any examples of governance structures that utilize this probabilistic risk assessment that you're talking about when assessing fees or any sort of damages the space industry can learn from?
Yeah, it's used in most of the lawsuits that have been brought, especially in the United States, against corporations and the government for climate change effects. So there's used a lot in the legal context, and it's also in a traditional risk-based assessment. It's used in the IPCC climate report. The storyline approach is so new that it hasn't, and it actually has gotten a great deal of pushback in the climate science community. There's a lot of worry that moving away from the traditional framework of working to minimize type 1 errors will open people up to making too many mistakes, falsely attributing too many times, losing public confidence. And those are real worries. But the storyline approach's response is the bigger worry should be not doing enough to prevent the negative effects. And not doing enough to protect future generations in the sense of climate change, and then in space context, protect space for space use for future generations, and for those who haven't historically gotten to use space as much as other countries and entities.
Thanks. Certainly important to look at climate change analogies since we are trying to preserve space in a similar way. So really appreciate that this problem has been looked at in that framework too. You know, along the lines of making sure everyone has access to space, LaQuila and Janet, you talked about, you know, how to use tribal airports as spaceports, but I was wondering historically, you mentioned at one point that these airports have lagged behind U.S. federal airports in development. Sort of what's the backstory there? Are there further calls to develop this airport infrastructure from tribal leaders? And what does that mean for thinking about spaceports and economic development?
So I'm actually theorizing here as to what happened. If you look at NIPIAS and you look at the current status of the American airports, he's telling me, you know, the current funding, I'm assuming is tied to, and somebody in the audience may know this better, but the current funding is probably tied to employments and, you know, the activity with respect to the local community, and they are local airports. But then I have to sit back and think, well, wait a minute. We started looking at a few of the airports now, like Pocatello in Idaho, I believe. And what we found is some of these airports live on or are on former reservation land. So the land was taken from the tribe, which then leads one to believe that there are more than one airport that is sitting on former reservation land, and so it was taken. And what happened with the tribe, you know, was there any sort of compensation, et cetera? And I don't think there was. So I think the problem is, again, very deep rooted in history and what has happened throughout the years since, you know, the reservations were developed. And then, of course, as I'm learning more and more about the reallocation of American Indian, Native American land through the, you know, early part of the last century, it's almost like digging a hole and then how do you get out of it?
I can go on to the follow-on question. So you talked about this a bit in your presentation already. I mean, it's really important to consider the local community as you're developing a spaceport. And as of right now, spaceports have somewhat lagged in economic impact given the launch rate is not what people predicted. But what can we do to help promote the sustainability of these potential tribal spaceports? And, you know, whether that's with companies or the local government, what do you think that they can better do to work with tribes to run the space economy and just really get tribal participation in all of this?
I think the biggest part is the communication aspect. A good majority of the time when federal agencies try to do or conduct any type of business on tribal land, they're kind of left out of the loop from the get-go. And then once decisions have been made or plannings for certain businesses, they are pulled in close to the end of those developing plans. So the biggest thing that I've read and I found is pretty much the communication process and the face-to-face dialogue and the follow-through and that process with tribal leaders and yeah.
The only other thing I can add is that there are many, many different business models we try. And one is a private tribal spaceport, right? Not a commercial, but one that is totally for the indigenous communities. You know, another may be to see if they can lease land to a private launch operator and therefore get money in return. So the thing that I think about is Vancouver International Airport is actually partially on Musqueam land in Canada, and there's an arrangement that the Musqueam people get 1% of the non-aeronautical revenues, which is equivalent to about $5 million a year. So there are other things that can be done that bring revenue into the local communities, as well as ways to get the local communities and the tribes more involved in the space economy as a whole.
So Dan, I'd also love to hear more thoughts on that from you, but I wanted to follow on as well with, in your abstract, you mentioned the Skyworld station, that's an indigenous space station, critical to the future of indigenous self-determination. We often see Spaceflight in the media keyword right now is the billionaire playground. Why is this continued access to Spaceflight, whether that's access to private spaceport or access to space capabilities, and this indigenous off-orbit habitat or off-world habitat that you mentioned, what does that mean for indigenous self-determination?
Okay, so regarding an indigenous space station, yes, we're working on that. But to backtrack a little bit about spaceports, there's a couple of things that are necessary to talk about. First one is the relationship between tribal people and the federal government is called the Federal Tribal Trust Responsibility. There's a unique relationship between Native American people and the United States government. We have in different agencies in the federal government something called the Office of Tribal Affairs in these agencies. And what you do not see in NASA is this agency. You do not see an Office of Tribal Affairs at NASA. Now we can go back to things like, with Mark as an example, we talk about, maybe astronomy. So astronomy is not an agency per se, but it is a perspective of indigenous people, how they see things in the sky, as an example, through dark skies, night skies, and those kind of things, in the increasing of satellites and debris in space, traffic management capabilities, and those kind of things. But there is no Office of Tribal Affairs at NASA. So if there was, we would be talking about a different narrative here, because we know and we understand that we have Wallops, we have Kennedy Space Center, we have Edinburgh Air Force Base and Kodiak, as an example. So our limitations in launch are limited, right? So we look at this launch case that we know that we have this backlog of thousands of satellites, but we have what we call a bottleneck of a launch capability. So we look at how is it that from a national, maybe a security perspective, a national security perspective, a Department of Defense perspective, a rapid launch in the Air Force, the Air Force Research Laboratory wants rapid launch, 24-hour launch capability. How do you do that? Now we talk about getting back to that idea of maybe indigenous lands, how we take care of it, stewardship, caretakers of land, caretakers of airspace, caretakers of space. If we have a spaceport, okay, so a spaceport, we see these grand visions of spaceports like Kennedy Space Center as an example. But that doesn't have to be that way today. We can have eco-friendly launches where you can bring in 6 vans worth of equipment and set up a launch, and being able to launch a small, medium-sized rocket into orbit and deploy satellites. So what has to happen if we're looking, because we're looking at specifically inland launch, vertical orbital launch capability. So in order to do that, we have to be able to bring the first stage back down to Earth safely. And we do that through a device, Galaxy LLC, which I'm working with my wife Robin, is to create a device by steerable parachute to be able to bring that first stage rocket down safely. So to enable vertical orbital inland launch on reservation lands for tribal spaceports. So we have looking at that ability to do that, but it's necessary. Spaceports are necessary in this way to be eco-friendly, but also to be able to increase the launch cadence, to be able to move those satellites that are wanting to go into orbit, that are manifested to go into orbit, but are backlogged because of the ability to launch them. So this is one opportunity for the federal tribal trust relationship to work with tribal people from the national security point of view, to be able to have a tribal spaceport, to be able to increase that launch cadence. But at the same time, we are also cognizant about space traffic management. Because we talked about the space station again, if we were to have an indigenous space station, if we put human space, people space and human space flight, we have a debris problem. So here at the United Nations level, I'm also on the United Nations Indigenous Committee. That again, human right to go to space, equal access to space, a right of self-determination. But if we go to space in a space way, human way, an indigenous space station as an example, a world indigenous space station, not just Native American, but world indigenous space station. That we're at a time that we're talking about doing that. When we have here in this audience, we're talking about space debris, space traffic management, space traffic control, active debris removal, on-surface assembly and manufacturing. Now, one of the things that tribal people can do, what we can get behind space station or a space, spaceport, or working with and the working between tribal governments and the space industry. But also the ability to understand, going back to the beginning of what we are, caretakers of land, caretakers of our airspace, and caretakers of space. That is where active debris removal and on-service assembly and manufacturing is something that tribal people can do. It is something that indigenous people can understand, that we have an orbital space debris problem, and that indigenous people can understand that we want to be able to clean that up, take care of it, because that's what we do. So there are a lot of aspects to what I just said here, from being able to help with national security, the federal tribal trust relationship, equal access right to space, the right of self-determination, but at a time that we have problems that we're talking about space debris. It seems to the point to where, and I'm going to finish up here about how I feel about environmental racism. Painful. It's painful because there's a lot of people who have voices that are suppressed. And in some way, when we talk about space debris and the fact that tribes are now wanting to go into space, that we have this suppression, this environmental racism issue of orbital space debris on indigenous populations that want to go into space. So yeah, it's painful, but we have to look at it. We have to reframe things, and do not forget about indigenous people when you're talking about space industry and space debris, active debris removal, on-service assembly manufacturing, because I think those are the things that tribal people can definitely help.
Thanks, Dan. And I wanted to go to Shannon next. So, in going into this environmental racism piece and trying to figure out, how to attribute the costs that are associated with orbital debris to current actors in space. The liability convention hasn't really been tested. There is a lot of debris up there. I think, Shannon, your proposal is certainly a very interesting way to start to address this issue. A bit of background: the FCC in its current rulemaking proposed bond requirement for the successful disposal of satellites. This runs aground of an issue of a very low probability but very high cost event that potentially bankrupt a company. company losing many millions of dollars in bonds for an event that is not necessarily their fault, like being hit by a micrometeorite. So it's a problem that the US government's trying to deal with right now. The SEC gathers information on satellite operations and apply for a license regarding orbital debris mitigation. But in general, they rely on the operators to provide correct information about how their systems operate, which may not necessarily be the case. And certainly the SEC does not necessarily know the finer details of the space architectures. So Shannon, given this sort of trusted information that we're getting purely from space operators, how do you think we can go about assessing the probability of the environmental harm from these constellations? We just don't have that much existing data in open, transparent form, at least. And we're very reliant on self-assessed risk. But how do we address that?
I mean, yeah, there the way I see it, there really is only one kind of path forward to address that in any substantial way, and that is to require the information be more forthcoming, which is difficult because right now we have very few mechanisms to require, especially private companies, to disclose information that they might find proprietary. But I think hopefully as we get further into the development of this kind of sustainability effort, individual actors will see the benefit, if for no other reason than to themselves, to providing this information, because it will ensure their ability to continue operating in space without significant damage. But one thing that I wanted to point out that I think is an important distinction going forward is, so there's a lot of talk about liability, and liability is one component of it, but in the climate change forum, what has been happening is these lawsuits some of them are stalling because it's difficult to get liability proven, or even if you are able to, it's difficult to get it actually honored. So people are just shifting towards looking instead towards accountability, which is more forward-looking. So instead of requiring, based on a past harm, a company to fix it or pay for it, it would be based on that past harm, requiring the company to take extra steps in the future to prevent that kind of harm from happening, and maybe have to contribute more towards mitigation and remediation efforts than an actor that doesn't have that past history of harmful effects would have. But again, all this is predicated on getting access to a lot of information that is right now dark.
Thanks. And sort of as a follow-on question, one method that is currently being worked on to determine this probabilistic risk is the space sustainability rating, which is housed with EPFL right now. Companies submit their satellite architecture information to this independent rating system. They receive a Yelp point review on sustainability. Do you think this current versus stick approach has a role, or what should the role be in the future?
I think it's a great approach. I mean, I think stick might still have a place, but the carrot works too. And if you look at the analog in the climate change and fossil fuel industry case, the stick has worked with variable utility. More and more companies like ExxonMobil, for example, are now switching towards funding more beneficiary endeavors. Of course, there's still other things that are, of course, problematic, but that they're incentivized to take this positive step forward, and that seems to be working a little bit more. But I'm not sure that I want to come out and say one or the other is better. I think introducing an element of forward-looking accountability and a beneficiary structure is a great way to go, given that we haven't had a whole lot of progress in the climate change domain, working with just backward-looking liability attribution.
Thanks. It looks like we have a question from the internet. So I think this can be for Dan, LaQuila, or Janet. It asks, what role can non-sovereign tribes play in this broader?
Non-sovereign tribes, okay, in the space economy. But I had a thought before I wanted to answer that, because we had talked about this last night about, because we're here on a sustainability panel, but don't really understand the definition of what space, what a sustainable space is. What does that mean? Right, so a sustainable space, to me, it requires space sustainability. So you could tonight and say, well, what does that mean? Space sustainability in order to have a sustainable space. So you're talking about things like space traffic management, space traffic coordination, control, on-site assembly manufacturing, active debris removal. In order to have a sustainable space, you have to have the sustainability in space. That means we have to have those abilities to do those things. So if we have debris that we have to move, that we know there's a conjunction event that's going to happen, that's going to be catastrophic. We have to be sustainable in space in a way that we have to be able to have the ability to take that debris and remove it to mitigate the threat of collision. That is what being sustainable in space means, is that we have the ability, working in space, to be able to mitigate the threats that's necessary to be sustainable in space. Now, getting back to the question about maybe non-sovereign tribes and how they work with the space industry, right? I think that was the question. How do we work together? And I think that's regardless of whether you're a federally recognized tribe, a state tribe that's not federally recognized, or non-tribal entities that are wanting to work with the space industry to do these things that we're talking about, right? So whether space traffic management or their launch capability, or working on satellites as an example. So I think now we're working on, NASA, the ability to have an Office of Tribal Affairs. So imagine a set aside by Office of Tribal Affairs at NASA, have that be the fact that we are able to work with the space industry on things, whether it be landers or rovers, or habitats, or space vehicles, or whatever it is that we're working together as tribal people, working with the space industry. Space industry is working with tribal people. You're raising the social and economic status of Native American reservations that are typically normally poor, that don't have. And then you have STEM scholars. The STEM scholars, they go out, they go to get their degree, they go to Boeing, they go to Lockheed Martin, they go to elsewhere, they go elsewhere. They leave the reservation, they drain the reservation of mental resources, because they don't have the ability to have their space facilities on the reservation to be able to come back and have their engineers working on rovers and landers and habitats and those kinds of things. That is what has to happen. So regardless of whether you're talking about native entities, space entities like Abelson LLC, like what I'm working on, or United First Nations Planetary Defense and Intertribal Space Agency, those kinds of entities, and those that are tribal state recognized entities that are not federally recognized, still have the ability to work with the space industries. There's no preclusion. It's all about including everyone. So we go into space, we go to space together. We go Artemis program, we go to the moon, we go together. It's all about this vision of unification. A unified vision of space means that we are unified. That means inclusion, not exclusion. And that's where we need to go. And so that's what I like to say is we're going to go to the moon, Mars. We're going to go to the moon, Mars to stay. It's all about inclusion. We have to work together. Everybody's in the same boat to be able to do this. It's necessary that we all work together. There is no exclusion. It has to be inclusion. That's what the unified vision of space is about.
Any further thoughts, LaQuila or Jen?
With me and my experience from leaving the reservation and going and getting my college education, it's exactly like how he states. I can't go back to my reservation to want to pursue what my degree program is. So we'll see.
Any audience questions? I have a bunch more. Yep, go ahead.
I'm sure you guys have thought about this, but I live in Las Vegas and I live about a block away from the Virgin Hotel Casino. Now, the Virgin Hotel Casino has a casino, and that casino happens to be run by the Mohegan tribe, which is right there in one building. You've got Virgin on the top, you've got the Mohegan tribe on the bottom. They have the money, they have the resources, it's all within one building. That's something to take into account when trying to build something like this. Because I know it is very difficult to raise money for things, especially if it's a good cause. But in a singular building, you have the whole thing. The second, of course, tribe that I know of that has the most money is the Seminole Indian tribe in Florida, who runs the Hard Rock brand. And they also run the Hard Rock casinos, and they also have a phenomenal amount of money and would be very willing to invest in your endeavors, I think. That's it.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
Mark?
So I like the presentation, but I'm all on the one map. You showed all the different spaceports built and proposed. My question is, what model for spaceport would be your recommendation? Is it something like Spaceport America? I used to live in Albuquerque, and so that's where New Mexico has been investing a lot of money with maybe not a lot of launches. You've got a national security kind of thing, where rapid launch, where your spaceport customer is national security launches. You've got maybe indigenous people that want to launch their own rockets. What model spaceport would you recommend as being if you were going to do that? Because, like, yes, there's lots of spaceports, but maybe not a lot of. You have to tailor it to meet some goal. What would you recommend there?
Okay, I'm gonna go with that one first. So what I said earlier was that there are a lot of business models. So, and it may vary tribe to tribe, location, airspace, everything that comes into play when you have to decide, or you decide what kind of site operator license to go for. But I don't think there's a clear answer yet. I'm really excited about this research because I think it has so many layers of complexity, and kind of coming up with one recommended business model, I think, is almost impossible at this juncture. That's right, because if you look at the greenfield operations like Spaceport America, it was there before demand is there, right? So there's not necessarily money being made. If you look at Mojave, which has been very successful, but their revenue stream is coming from leasing of facilities, et cetera. And it's balanced by having the general aviation revenues coming in at the same time, which is why I initially looked at NIPIAS and looking at GA airports, thinking there was some sort of way to level the risk, while also looking at, is this possible even from an infrastructure standpoint? So it's a really great question. I don't know the answer, but it's so fun to find out.
Yeah.
So what kind of space tribal government has a spaceport? What would that look like? Now, I mentioned to you, you can have eco-friendly launches. So there's two parts to this. You have the ability to do things. So the launch is one thing, but all the other ancillary issues are another. It's like education component that goes with that. Facilities for building satellites as an example. Facilities for building the rocket for putting the rockets together. You have other types of maybe Artemis programs. So what I'm getting at is that the launch is one thing, but all the other facilities, all the other things that go with that are just as important for Indigenous people and to work together, to do things. For us to build satellites, for tribal people to build satellites as an example, to monitor our own resources, to support national security, and to monitor our borders as an example. Be able to have, Air Force research lab type of 24-hour launch capability for Sendai framework, ability to land, disaster relief supplies anywhere around the world within a matter of 24 hours. You snap your fingers and you're launching and you're landing a payload of disaster relief supplies around the world. Those are the kinds of capabilities that we're looking at and wanting to do from the tribal point of view. And so it is, when you look at it all told together, you know, it is about the space industry working with indigenous people to be able to do, you know, to create these goals of maybe it's the Artemis program, maybe it's about national security, or maybe it's about climate change. You know, recently, you know, the White House came up with a new space policy that moved towards climate change, basically providing the opportunity for tribal governments to create their own satellites, to monitor their own resources, to monitor climate change and habitats. So we need, it's our responsibility now as indigenous people to take that up, to be able to say, you offered this, now it is our turn just to be able to monitor our own resources. And part of what I'm talking about has to do with cultural preservation. So if we look at going to the moon and Mars to stay, where is this issue of cultural preservation and being able to do that? Is there sometime in the future, we talk about 7 generations, thinking about our children's children, our children's children down the line, 7 generations? What is it that the indigenous people are going to need to know? What are we going to need to do? Where is that data sovereignty of our own capability of having our own satellites with our own data? Then the ability to have that cultural preservation to the moon and Mars, if that's what's going to happen in the future. But the point is, we don't know what's going to happen in the future. But we need that opportunity for tribal people to make their own decisions on how they're going to preserve their culture into the future. By not having that opportunity, by being excluded from it, that is what that limits us to what our cultural preservation could be into the future. So it is about, going back to my Oneida roots, my Oneida nation, you know, from the Iroquois Confederacy, our beginning, our creation story is of Skyworld. It begins in the sky. We're comfortable there. We're comfortable. I'm comfortable talking about space things. Not comfortable about environmental racism, not talking about those kind of things, about working together with this idea of a unified vision of space. We need to be included.
So we're almost out of time, so I just wanted to do one last round. I think, you know, one overarching theme in all of this is just the global nature of space and the need for access, particularly to space from people who have not traditionally had access, or, you know, being able to attribute environmental harm to the actors who have created a large amount of space debris. Do we need new governance structures to deal with these issues globally, whether that's, you know, the environmental harm being caused, and to ensure countries are equally, you know, using the probabilistic risk assessment, ensuring access to space, or to be able to include, you know, indigenous communities when we're so focused on launching space in the UN. So I will just go down the line, Shannon, if you want to start on, do we need a new governance structure to deal with this and make sure countries are coordinated on?
New compared to, I don't know what, one that works would be preferable. We do need a much more better cooperative structure. I don't know that I want to wade in too far on what a new governance structure would look like for this. I think we can get by maybe with what we have with the United Nations and with, you know, our kind of piecemeal operations, if we cooperated better and had more amiable relations, you know, connected by a common goal of making space accessible and sustainable for everyone. I don't know whether that is attainable with what we have, but it seems like it's possible.
Go ahead, Jen, we need a new governance structure.
Well, do we need a new governance structure? I think that what we need to do is we need to have a dialogue. Indigenous people, indigenous leaders need to have a dialogue with NASA, but there has to be that. So does it need a new structure? No, what we need to do is we need to have a responsive NASA that is that understands that indigenous people we're here, we're here, you know, we're here. That's hard, but one of the things that, you know, in the previous panel, you know, with Ruth is, you know, the idea of reusability of space. One of the big things that's right in my mind that, you know, that I'm trying to deal with and wrestle with is, you know, the International Space Station, and how we're going to reutilize it, how we're going to destroy it, right? So from an indigenous point of view, we want to be able to not do that, right? So one of those things that we need to talk about is how we see things. We need to see things differently. We need to reframe things differently. We're talking about OSAM here. We're talking about space sustainability. Does it make sense to have the International Space Station destroyed? So, I mean, you know, these are the things that, from my point of view, as a Native American person, I have problems with. And so we definitely need a dialogue with NASA on how we do things and our perspective and how we work together. That has to happen.
Thanks. And then finally, Janet, LaQuila, any thoughts on spaceports, what Dan was talking about in regard to dialogues? I know you mentioned some examples of how the federal government has worked on airport programs before as well.
I can add a little bit, I think, to that last discussion. LaQuila did some research into the Tesla manufacturing facility, and found out that there needed to be a change in laws at the state level, in order that there would not be, you know, he didn't use it on their own, they were saying the double taxation. And then, of course, we get the gaming industry available to the Airbnb. There was the gaming and the devices that allowed the tribes in the states to contact and agree that we are into. And I really believe that with respect to space and space sport, something has to occur at the federal and the state and the local level. And even beyond that, if you look at indigenous communities at the global level, there may need to be some sort of structure that occurs that, you know, you can get some of these other indigenous communities to talk to each other globally.
Working. Oh, now it does. But yeah, going back to Santa Ana, Pueblo, a lot of that context, and the research that I ended up finding, like the federal taxation and how that correlated with everything. It just goes back to pretty much the communication and the dialogue face to face. It's really.
Okay, I think we are out of time. Okay, we'll figure it out by the next panel. Thanks so much, everyone. Really appreciate it.